iPhone 13 mini, iPhone 13, iPhone 13 Pro, and iPhone 13 Pro Max. So we're going to unbox the 13s, then the 13 Pros, and then we can actually test the new features to see if they live up to Apple's hype. Okay, let's start with the $699 iPhone 13 mini. And as expected, Apple has kept the same slimline, chargerless packaging as last year. So you get your phone on top, you get a cable, manuals, a single Apple sticker, and that's all, folks. Next up is the $799 normal iPhone 13. And you probably realized that actually this time round, we don't even get the plastic wrap on the outside of boxes. Apple says it's better for the environment. I mean, it probably is. I highly doubt they've dropped this plastic sheet to reduce costs, but it doesn't change the fact that Apple used to make some of the most satisfying box peels ever. And I'd be lying if I said that it doesn't lose a bit of that magic here. I do wonder, like, 10 years down the line, are we just going to get phones shipped in their own recycled paper bags? Is that the direction we're moving in? Yes. Regardless, the contents inside are identical. Oh, also, I've saved up myself and bought 10 iPhone 13s to give away to you, starting right now. Rules are in the description. I'll remind you again at the end. Okay, so my very first thought when I picked up the iPhone 13 and 13 mini was, these feel like the iPhone 12s. After bulking season. From a lot of angles, they look similar. They have the same matte finish aluminium rails on the sides, which I'm actually a fan of, so that's fine, but then also the same high gloss fingerprinty glass on the back. Slightly less of a fan, although picking a lighter color does help. The cameras look noticeably bigger, like actually enormous on this 13 mini. But the main physical difference is really that they're both about 0.3mm thicker than their predecessors and up to 10 grams heavier. In my opinion on this whole flat design hasn't really changed. I still really like the way it looks, I still strongly dislike the way it feels. But as far as how the 13s compare to the 12s, at least for these smaller iPhones, I don't think the extra bulk is an issue. The 13 mini still feels mini, the 13 still feels regular. And because last year's phones were almost eerily light, if anything the extra weight here just makes the 13s feel a little more reassuring. There's a good amount to wrap your hands around. They've also brought all the buttons down on the 13, so everything's a little more reachable. And surprise perk here, I was fully expecting the thicker camera module on the back to create more table wobble, but it actually stabilizes the phone. The iPhone 12s would rock significantly from two opposing corners. The 13 only rocks when you press the top left. The colors I've got are fine. I mean, this 13 mini here is Starlight. It's a little more blue than the straight black we had last year, but you probably wouldn't notice if they weren't sitting side by side. And the pink is, well, do you know what? I actually prefer it. I like it more in person than I did watching the event, but I still just can't help but wonder if it would have looked better with more saturation. As it stands in some lighting, I could totally see this just looking like off-white. Anyways, now we're on to the iPhone 13 Pro, which starts at $999. You might have noticed actually that as well as matching the color of the accents to whichever color phone you've bought, Apple also has this overarching color theme with their products, of white being for the mainstream consumer, black being for the pros. But still no charger. And I still think it's a shame. I have a full video explaining why, which I'll link after this one, but equally, Apple isn't the only company doing this anymore. And then of course, we have the iPhone 13 Pro Max, the highest end iPhone that you can buy right now, starting at $1,099. And thankfully I have managed to get this in the color that I was most excited to see. They're calling this Sierra Blue. So, to get one thing out of the way, I do think that Apple's Pro lineup of phones right now is a good looking bunch, even if they don't think that I am. Will you go out with me?
No thanks.
With the iPhone 12 Pro Max, I'd say I've had at least 10 occasions where I've taken this phone out of my pocket to like pay at a shop or something, and then someone has said, whoa, which phone is that? Or if they realize it's an iPhone, which iPhone is that? However, at the same time, I do wish that, just like with this pink iPhone 13, that these Pro colors were punchier. As things stand, this blue actually looks more like a grey in person, and the gold looks more like a carpet or curtain color. There were some rumors that we were going to get a bronzy sunset option for the Pro this time round, which I think would have just been god tier. But it looks like Apple is pretty firmly set on making the Pros muted. Anyways, given that their starting price is literally $300 higher, do the Pros feel better than the 13s? Well, just like last year, they swap out that glossy glass on the back for frosted matte glass. Definite improvement in that it gives you one less piece of maintenance. But then, again like last year, they also swap out the matte finish aluminium rails on the sides for high gloss stainless steel, which I just don't understand. Apple has already established that matte finishes are more premium. That's why the Pros are mostly matte, the normal phones aren't. Plus, the aluminium would have made these Pros lighter, which because of how dense they now are, thanks to beefier batteries and weightier camera systems, they could have really benefited from. You might remember that last year, the 12 Pro and the 12 Pro Max were some of the heaviest phones you could get in their respective size categories, at 189 grams and 224 grams. But this year, that's gone up to 204 and 240. I don't think it makes them completely unpalatable, but this 13 can be a little tiring to hold for long periods of time. Like I was trying to take a thumbnail for a video coming very soon, and every minute or so of holding it out like this, I had to take a breather. Also, the camera modules on the Pros are even bigger than the camera modules on the 13s, which means that if you're using the smaller size one, there's a good chance that your fingers will overlap. Anyways, probably more significant than the slight design differences versus last year are the actually new features. So, there are 8 key things that Apple talked about. You can see them on the side here. We're going to go through them, and we're going to test them. For starters, all iPhone 13s are powered by the new A15 Bionic chipset. So, I've lined up an iPhone 12, a 12 Pro, a 13, a 13 Pro, and a 13 Pro Max. And if we test the performance using Geekbench, we actually get a bit of a weird result. When we run the CPU benchmark, which simulates how fast each phone can crunch through general tasks, we actually see a pretty standard expected bump in power. The iPhone 12s all sit at about 4,000 in total, and the iPhone 13s are all sitting at about 4,700, 4,800, which makes them just over 15% better. But then when we run the GPU test, which is looking at graphic intensive tasks, and simulates how well they'll be able to play games amongst other things, it gets a little murky. Both the iPhone 12 and 12 Pro have very similar performance, but between the 13s, there's an enormous gap. The normal 13 is about 20% better than the iPhone 12s, but the 13 Pros are actually almost 60% more capable, in part thanks to having 5 GPU cores instead of 4 on the normal 13. Now, on one hand, that is an unexpectedly enormous improvement. That's the equivalent of the 13 Pros being a whole generation ahead of the 13s. But I also think Apple should have made this clearer. They're calling the chips on both the iPhone 13 and the iPhone 13 Pro the A15, as if they're somehow the same thing, when actually in some ways there's a bigger gap between these two versions of the same chip than even the gap between the A15 and last year's A14. It's great if you're thinking about getting a Pro, but a pretty standard, more subtle bump in power if you're considering the normal 13. The second thing is MagSafe. So, I was half expecting Apple to announce that they'd improved MagSafe this year, given how much of a push they gave the feature with the iPhones last year, and how, at the same time, it wasn't exactly the most reassuringly strong connection, and could have done with an update. They didn't do that. But they have released an updated MagSafe wallet, which has a built-in tracker, such that if it ever does get detached, it will tell you the exact location that it was detached. It's a good idea, and it works as advertised, but it is also a little alarming that we even need a feature like this, that your wallet can just slip off. There is one new feature though that I think is a complete no-brainer win, and that's the new screens. So this is last year's iPhones versus this year's iPhones. And aside from the obvious reduction in notch size, you can also see that if we crank them all up to max brightness, that the iPhone 12 is the dimmest, as it sits at around 625 nits. Then the iPhone 12 Pro from last year and the base iPhone 13 from this year are about the same, at 800 nits, and then the iPhone 13 Pro sits right at the top at 1000 nits. I feel like the difference in practice isn't quite as much as those numbers make it sound, but safe to say, max brightness isn't an issue on any of these iPhone 13s. And if anything, what I would actually love to see is a lower level of minimum brightness, because I do still find that when I'm sitting in a pitch black room about to sleep, it is still a little too bright. But brightness aside, the displays on the 2021 Pros now also refresh up to 120 times per second versus 60. And we already know what 120Hz looks like, but I guess this is just me confirming that iOS does take good advantage of that. And the animations have all been very clearly optimized such that even if you're watching back at a quarter speed, you will struggle to see a dropped frame. The screens we've ended up with, really they're pretty comparable to the ones on Samsung or Xiaomi's highest end phones, except that the iPhones have stuck with this completely flat design and a notch, while most Androids have opted for curved screens with a hole punch. But alright, I would say that the things that I am most excited about with these phones are pretty much all to do with the cameras. I actually read a lot of your comments after my iPhone 13 reaction video, and there seemed to be quite a strong sentiment that these iPhone 13s are basically the same as the iPhone 12s, and that Apple just isn't doing anything new anymore. And I think this is why. See, I am personally someone who spends a lot of time taking photos and videos. For me, it's a hobby, and it's my job. And so the fact that probably 50% of the improvements this time are camera related, that is exciting for me. But I can also see how, from the perspective of someone for who photos are just a way of keeping memories, they don't really matter. From my angle though, this is what I think is good, this is what I think is bad. So, first up is cinematic video. And I am so excited about its premise, but also slightly disappointed by its execution. So what it does is constantly assesses depth information. It decides how far everything is away from the camera, and then it applies a proportional amount of blur to mimic the feeling of a high-end cinema camera. And I think what's impressive about it is that they have managed to make this cinematography easy. There's a lot of subtle, clever things going on with the phone to make sure that for you, the user, you just don't have to think about it. They've made it such that I could probably hand one of these to my grandma, and she'd not just be able to easily use it, but will also be able to capture footage that, as far as she's concerned, will look professional. I think that while this isn't quite it yet, this is the beginning of a new era in filmmaking. You know that over time, as smartphone cameras have ramped up, they have been slowly but surely swallowing up the dedicated camera market, starting from the low-end point-and-shoot and working their way up. And I think that this tech is going to result in phones consuming the next rung of that ladder. However, what makes me so sure that this isn't it yet is that it turns out you can only record in 1080p resolution with this mode, which is low enough that even if you're watching back on just your iPhone screen, you can still tell that it's not pin sharp. Plus the general softness that you see around the edges of objects. But mark my words, with enough computing power, these are all solvable problems. Every iPhone this year also has sensor shift stabilization, although to be honest the difference seems pretty subtle versus last year's, which used normal optical image stabilization. The next one is clever though. I don't think it's being used to its maximum, but this feature has the potential to correct one of the main flaws of the iPhone's camera in a lot of people's eyes. See, Apple pitches their cameras as tools. They're used by a lot of vloggers, professionals, and just creative people. And so because of this, they are built to only ever take photos that look as natural as possible. Some people like that, but I feel like as humans we're almost wired to default to preferring colours that are brighter and more vivid. And so there's a fair few people I know who straight out the camera just prefer the way that, say, Samsung's images look. However, the iPhone 13s come with a feature called photographic styles that can tune the images to your preferences. And if you look carefully, you can see that these are not just simple filters. They are actually identifying what's in the photo and treating them separately. Notice how my face doesn't change between these two modes, but the background does. That said, the only two things that you can change are tone, which seems to just adjust the darkness of shadows, and warmth. I think this feature could have really benefited from a vibrant slider to control color intensity. But really the biggest change that Apple's been talking about here is that every camera on each of these new iPhones has been upgraded. Bigger sensors and wider apertures, further zooms, and at least based on the numbers that they gave us about how much more light they let in, etc., this should be the biggest camera jump we've ever had on an iPhone. So first of all, the 12 and 12 Pro had a 2x zoom camera. The 12 Pro Max had a 2.5x zoom camera. This time around, both 13 Pros have a 3x zoom camera. So this is what last year's Pro looked like, this is what this year's Pro looked like. And if you crop in, pretty simple, obvious improvement. And as for how much difference the better lenses and sensors have made, well, to be honest, it depends on lighting. If you just hopped out and took a random photo in broad daylight, it's going to look pretty similar on iPhone 12, iPhone 13, and iPhone 13 Pro. The 13 Pro is a bit sharper and a little bit clearer when you get up close, but to be honest, I think Apple is reaching the limits of how much you can do with a 12 megapixel resolution cap. If you're in low light though, the disparity does become clearer. And to be honest, just like with graphics performance, I would say that the jump between the 13 and the 13 Pro is bigger than the jump between the 12 and the 13. But it only becomes most clear when you actually manually force each phone to capture the night mode shot for its full maximum 10 seconds. Because by default, the newer phones will actually try to spend less time gathering light, which is almost fighting against the fact that these sensors are bigger and they let in more light. That said, the number that Apple quoted was a 2.2 times improvement. This doesn't feel like a 2.2 times improvement. And to be honest, we've probably seen a bigger change when it comes to the ultra-wide cameras. And then finally, the Pro phones can also use their ultra-wide cameras to take macro photos. So, as you bring your phone towards an object, as soon as you get about 14 centimeters away from it, you will see the phone automatically switching lenses to the ultrawide. And then you'll find yourself being able to get very, very close. It is easily one of the best macro cameras you can get, and easily one of the best camera systems in general you can get. But if you want to find out if it is the best, I've got a really fun, proper camera comparison versus Samsung's best coming very soon. So stay tuned for that. But I will just say, I think macro mode activates a little too early. Given that the main camera is the highest quality camera, you'd want to use that for as many photos as possible, right? Except as soon as you approach an object, even if your main camera could still focus on it, your phone just decides actually, nah, you're going to use the macro. And I can't see a way to turn this off. Okay, here's your reminder to enter the giveaway. Rules are in the description. And if you do want to see why I'm not sold on this whole no charger situation, you can find that video here. My name is Aaron, this is Mr. Who's the Boss, and I'll catch you in the camera comparison.